Welcome everyone to this Dublin Book Festival event. Are You With Me? Mike Chinoy in conversation with Donncha O'Connell. We're very happy to have these speakers here with us today. This event will be recorded and shared through the Dublin Book Festival website after the event. At the end of it, there will be a Q&A, so if people have questions, please do enter them in the chat and I can read them out to the speakers at the end. You can also purchase Are You With Me? Mike's wonderful biography of Kevin Boyle through the Gutter Bookshop and through the Lilliput Press Bookshop. I'm sending the link to everyone through the chat, so if you're interested, please do check that out. Introducing our speakers, Mike Chinoy, former foreign correspondent for CNN, has won Emmy, Peabody and DuPont Awards for his journalism. While he worked primarily in China and elsewhere in Asia, he also reported on the Troubles in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s. Here he met Kevin Boyle. Chinoy is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the University of Southern California's US-China Institute and is based in Hong Kong. Donncha O'Connell is an established professor of law at NUI Galway. He was from 2012 to 2020 a commissioner of the Law Reform Commission and was also from 2017 to 2018 a member of the Commission on the Future of Policing in Ireland. He was the Dean of the Faculty of Law at NUI Galway from 2005 to 2008 and was head of the School of Law from 2013 to 2017. He was the first full-time director of the Irish Council of Civil Liberties from 1999 to 2002 and had served on the boards of a number of human rights organisations. So I'm sure this will be a fascinating talk about Kevin Boyle and Mike's wonderful biography. Now I'll leave it to Donncha to begin the chat. Thanks, Donncha.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Many of you zooming into this event today will have known the late Kevin Boyle or read Mike Chinoy's warm, perceptive and absorbing biography published earlier this year by Lilliput. For those less familiar with his life and work, Kevin Boyle was born in Newry in 1943, the fourth child in a Catholic family of 9, whose father owned a taxi company and mother worked full-time in the home. He was a big but bookish boy who didn't like conflict and came to be known, perhaps ironically, as the King. Newry was a predominantly Catholic town, and Kevin grew up doing the things that respectable Catholic boys did: serving Mass, struggling with belief, studying hard, and staying out of trouble. He went on to study law at Queen's University, Belfast in 1961, where he became active in the Dramatic Society, not as an actor, but as a lighting expert, and developed a political awareness over time. After graduating in 1965, he went to Cambridge University to do a one-year graduate diploma course in criminology. This was a formative experience for Boyle, opening him up to the power, dynamics, and class inequalities that lie behind law, as well as the potential for using law as a mechanism to promote change and create a more just and equitable society. He returned to Queen's as a lecturer in 1966 and was shortly afterwards called to the Northern Ireland Bar. With others like Bernadette Devlin, Michael Farrell, and Eamon McCann, he was prominently involved in the radical civil rights organisation People's Democracy, and among those marching from Belfast to Derry in 1969, during which the marchers were subjected to vicious attacks by mobs at Burntullet without intervention by the RUC and B Specials. While this was a moment that confirmed the radicalisation of many, it remained a source, I think, of troubling concern to Boyle and indeed others long after 1969. Boyle went on to have a distinguished career as an academic and what nowadays would be referred to disparagingly by some as an activist lawyer. His combination of scholarship and activism, as well as hands-on advocacy, mark him out as a human rights figure of enduring significance well beyond these islands. He died 10 years ago following a brief illness. At the time, one of his many distinguished obituaries commented quite accurately, the world would have benefited from another 20 years of Kevin Boyle. So today we're very lucky to have Mike Chinoy, his biographer, who, as you can see, is joining us from the cliffs of Moher. He's actually in Hong Kong, the wonders of modern technology. And he is a journalist steeped in Asian affairs. He's written prolifically about China and North Korea, which really prompts me to ask, Mike, why did you write a book about Kevin Boyle?
Well, as Ruth mentioned in her brief introduction, apart from my experience in Asia, I did spend a lot of time covering the Troubles in the 70s and the 80s. And I knew Kevin Boyle quite well. I first went to Northern Ireland in the late spring of 1972. I accompanied my father, who was an American academic who'd been invited to give a lecture at Queen's University. And we arrived the weekend that the Ulster Defense Association was setting up its own no-go areas, because the nationalist areas had no-go areas, and the place was complete chaos and bedlam, but the university was a sort of oasis of calm. And after my father's talk, I met Kevin. My father was a sociologist, and Kevin was very interested in the sociology of law. And I discovered that he was about to come to the States for a year to spend a year as a visiting scholar at Yale University, where I was entering my final year. And so I had been active in the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement in the States, and had been sort of intrigued by the movement that had developed in Northern Ireland. So I convinced, I arranged with Kevin to supervise me in a sort of independent reading course on topics in Irish history. And we became friends, and he became something of an intellectual mentor and guide to help me understand Irish issues. And I became increasingly fascinated. And so after I finished my university education, my first attempts to be a foreign correspondent were in Northern Ireland. And I spent time there in 73 and 74 and 75. And then even after I moved to Hong Kong, I used to route myself back through Belfast on my way home for visits to the States. And when I joined CNN as the fourth foreign correspondent, hired by this fledgling new network in 1983, I was based in London and took over the Irish beat and made 6, 8, 10 trips a year for several years. And so Kevin and I remained in touch. But what prompted me to do the book was, after he died, his wife Joan told me about this remarkable archive of his papers that were given to NUI Galway. And when I was curious, and I looked at the PDF and of what's in the archive, and the document listing the documents is 500 pages long. And I was astonished by the range of stuff in there. And it became clear to me that while I knew Kevin was an important figure, I just got a tantalizing sense there was so much more. And so I thought it would be very interesting to try and get a deeper sense of who he was and what he did. So I embarked on what became an almost 4-year process, going through thousands and thousands of documents in the archives, conducting close to 150 interviews. And in the course of that, it became clear to me that while I thought I knew Kevin well, there were huge gaps in my understanding, partly because I wasn't around, and partly because he was a kind of modest, unassuming guy who didn't boast. And I discovered that he was crucially important at so many pivotal moments in the development of the Troubles and the peace process, and on the broader international stage. And that's what I kind of took away from all this years of research.
Yeah, I mean, the archive is remarkable. I mean, the amount of material that he didn't just accumulate, but that he kept, that everything seemed to be kept and kept very well, including Christmas cards and all sorts of things, and letters. I mean, he was a prolific correspondent, constantly writing to politicians and various people. We might come back to that later. I want to talk a bit about his kind of political, intellectual formation. You know, going to Queen's as a student in the 1960s, one of the first generation really of Catholics in Northern Ireland with expanded educational opportunities, really interesting people from a similar background in Queen's at the same time as him, and this kind of curiosity that he had about the other, you know, the other being, quite frankly, Protestants, because when he speaks all the time about transcending the divide, at that stage of his life, it was about transcending the sectarian divide in Northern Ireland, which of course becomes a theme in his life. So would you like to maybe talk to us about that part of his life, his formative years politically and intellectually in Queen's as a student? We'll come maybe later to his time there as a staff member as well.
Well, it became clear in talking to his family and going through material I found in the archive that he went through a process, probably like many young people, of skepticism and disillusion with sort of the established order. But he wasn't at Queen's sort of consciously political in the way, for example, that classmates like Eamon McCann or Michael Farrell were. But he was, in his own way, kind of moving away from this conventional Catholic background that he'd grown up in. And he sought out people from elsewhere, and he kind of absorbed, because Queen's was one of the things that's so interesting about Queen's was that it was a place where people from both communities mixed much more easily than almost anywhere else in Northern Ireland. And so I think that was important. And he was kind of on the fringes of some of the very early activism. And then, as you mentioned, he went over and spent a year away. And then when he came back and started teaching in '66, he already had a kind of developing political consciousness that something was wrong in the North, and that led him to become, for example, one of the founding members in going to the first meeting of the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association and beginning to write about the inequities of the Special Powers Act and things like that. But he wasn't a rabble rouser. It was a more gradual intellectual evolution, I would say.
Yeah, and I think when in the parts of your book about people's democracy and about, the street politics in a sense of that time, it reminds me a bit of the Occupy movement and that kind of model. But there always seems to have been a kind of an ambivalence or a doubt, a kind of a nervousness about the certainties of others on the part of Kevin. He was clearly somebody who was more charismatic indoors than outdoors. He was good in a meeting, better in a meeting than at a rally or whatever. But what's that about? Or what do you think, what's that all about? Is that just because he was an overthinking academic, or is it just because he just lacked the certainties of others, or maybe hadn't had the same experiences as others? Because that's very strong in the book, and it's strong later as well.
Well, he grew up in NUI, which was a largely Catholic town, and did not have the same sharp sectarian tensions that you found in other communities in Northern Ireland. So he didn't come in with the sort of nationalist chip on the shoulder, in a sense, that some other people might have had. So his critique of the inequities of the system in Northern Ireland came from a more kind of intellectual working it through than because he himself felt he'd been subject to injustice or mistreatment. But I think, like many people, this was 1968 when he first got involved. 68 was the year of sort of radical student politics all around the world, in the States, May 68 in Paris. And he was kind of swept up in that. And what's interesting and what comes out when you look back at what he himself said and wrote and at the documents was how, I don't know if the right word is naive, but how almost oblivious some of these newly radicalized students were at the time. The borders was not a big issue. This was sort of British rights for British citizens, normal civil liberties that were being denied that ought to be granted. And he talked later in his life about how naive people were, and they didn't realize at the time that they were stirring up the sectarian hornet's nest that they ended stirring up. They honestly just, it didn't occur to them. And for Kevin, that recognition kind of gradually built, and it came to a head really with the attack on Burntollet, which he was very, he was against staging that march. There were more radical members of the People's Democracy, particularly Michael Farrell, who wanted to go ahead, and both Boyle and Bernadette Devlin, who was also initially against it, felt, well, we don't want to split the organization, let's go along. But he was leery of provoking violence. And one of the things I discovered was that he, along with Farrell, were the main contact point with the police. I found all of these memos, internal police memos, describing meetings that Superintendent so-and-so had to, you have to go down this road, no, you go down that road. So even as they were going into increasingly dicey territory, he was trying to find a way to get through it without trouble, although in the end the trouble found him. And I think he wasn't looking for, you know, a confrontation, although he did want to challenge and confront the system.
Yeah, and of course we forget that they were very young. I mean, these people were extremely young at the time, and you know, to have that kind of sense of leading a movement, or maybe not being leading it, but being part of a movement that you really, you know, can't control if you're concerned about that kind of thing, can actually be quite traumatizing, I think, for some people, or for people who lack certainty. And this is one of the things that I think comes across again and again in your book about Kevin. It's this always kind of perhaps overthinking, analyzing, questioning, very, very rational, and yet he's a believer. But you know, time kind of there's an ambivalence about these things on which others are certain.
Right. Well, also it's interesting. He was a professor. Almost everybody else in People's Democracy were students. So he was, you know, at least a few years older than most of them, and you know, uniformly, people that I interviewed talked about him being a kind of mature, more thoughtful, sober-minded person. And there's a wonderful description that I think it was Bernadette Devlin Michaliski gave me about that his apartment used to be the sort of headquarters. People gathered, People's Democracy activists, to plan their next event, and they would have these long meetings, and everybody smoking and refilling their glasses of Bushmills and printing off stuff on the mimeograph machine. And then Kevin would be going around saying, "Don't forget to get your schoolwork done. You got to still go to class." So he was a much more sort of mature figure trying to help channel this youthful energy in what he thought was a way that would make a difference.
But as Michael Farrell has pointed out to you in, you know, your interview for the book, for Kevin to be involved in this level of activism while a staff member at Queen's was an act of real courage. I mean, this was not a safe thing to do at that time for somebody at his level in an academic setting, even one that, you know, wasn't unaffected by the 60s. Queen's was still an institution in which this brought some risk, I would have thought.
I think you're absolutely right, and it was the first of many instances that became apparent to me as I did the research for Are You With Me, of a kind of quiet but really strong. I mean, he was an extraordinarily brave guy, both sort of morally and physically. You know, risking your job to take these steps, and at Queen's was a union. You know, the law faculty at Queen's was where the future lawyers and officials of the Unionist Party were trained, and so he was, you know, taking that kind of risk. He took risks on the street later, and we can talk about this. He took risks going to South Africa during the heart of the worst years of apartheid. He took risks speaking out on behalf of Salman Rushdie when the writer was targeted by the Iranian regime. So he was an extraordinarily brave guy, although not in a sort of, you know, Rambo way, but he was doing things that took a lot of courage, and he did it consistently throughout his life.
Yeah, no, I think that's really clear. Then in 1975, he writes a book with Paddy Hilliard and Tom Haddon. Obviously, his writing partnership with Tom Haddon went on well beyond that. Do you see that kind of, you know, that was almost, what do you think that was a retreat from street politics more towards the kind of public intellectual in the public square? more kind of a more rarefied form of protest, or was it, you know, the emergence of a more reflective, strategic thinker? Was it the beginning of maybe becoming an insider, but perhaps a peripheral insider? Because that's certainly where he headed. But
Right.
was there any, I mean, from that time, was it, do you think, a conscious breach, or was it just, you know, a shift in emphasis on his part, or how thought through was that?
I think he always tried to approach things in a more sort of strategic way. But one of the things that I didn't really sense at the time was that the year he spent at Yale, the 72-73 academic year, which is where I really got to know him, turns out to have been a year that he sought this year's leave largely because he'd concluded after Bloody Sunday that there was no longer any space for the kind of street politics that he had been involved in, that between the terrorism of the provisional IRA and the tougher, harsher behavior of the British Army and security force, there simply wasn't any space for that. And so he pulled back, and he used that year at Yale to sort of reflect and think about what to do, and whether he sort of consciously said, I'm now going to do A, B, and C, I don't know. But what came out of that were two things that I think really defined his work for most of the rest of his life. And that was to try and make, to use the law more as a tool to effect change. Because in the spring of 72, he and his American colleague Hearst Hannum had brought this first case on behalf of individuals mistreated by the security forces, the famous Donnelly case. And that was the first of many that he would bring to the European Commission and then Court of Human Rights. And then the other part of it was this attempt to sort of apply bring the intellectual skills that he had to analyze what was going on and try and come up with concrete suggestions about how to make things better. And what's striking in so much of his writing, that first book and then the subsequent books with Tom Hadd and so on, is it's not just this is wrong, but this could be done differently. This is a way to get around it, and so on. So those two strands really shaped a great deal of what he did after that time.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when he was an academic and working as an academic, he was also a jobbing lawyer for a period of time, and then became maybe a more strategic litigator. But of course, the litigator has to be tactical as well as strategic, and the steps are frequently, I think smaller rather than the larger steps. There's also the complexity of, are you working for your client? Are you working for a cause? There was clearly the problem in Northern Ireland of it being somewhat futile to engage too much with the court system because it was such a failed system. And that, of course, through the influence of people like Hannum and others, focused him on the international system, which
I think
really significant.
That's true. Although I do in that sort of, after he came back from Yale, that sort of 73 to 77, 78 period, he did do a lot of legal work. I mean, I have memories of getting a lift downtown in Belfast, and he had his white wig in the front seat of the car to go up to the court. And he did do a lot of just regular legal work. And curiously, one of the things I discovered was that he partnered with Desmond Boyle, who was Ian Paisley's lawyer. And was very far apart from him politically. But this was one of the earliest examples of Boyle sort of transcending the sectarian divide on a host of issues. The two of them defended both Protestant and Catholic people, often youngsters, teenagers, young people who got caught up in the rioting, charged with this and that. But he reached a point where he didn't feel comfortable making money off of people's misfortune, and he also began to feel or wonder, am I defending somebody who got caught up in this because they might have gone to a rally couple of years before and heard me give a speech that led them, and now they're here for riding. And I think it's another thing that I sort of discovered, which was he had, I think, a great sense of, you sort of referred to, sense of unease about what he might have inadvertently been involved in helping to trigger without ever planning or wanting to do so. So he pulled back from that and made a conscious decision that future legal work would be on the international level, particularly in Strasbourg, where I think he felt he could take cases that were both interesting to him, but where the results could have, it's different than getting a 17-year-old off for throwing a petrol bomb. If you can get a ruling that forces a change in policy in ways that promote and protect people's rights.
Yeah, I think there was, my sense is though there were two things there. There was the idea of having the transcendent win, that you could transcend the dysfunction of local politics, of local law, and bring about change via some external scrutiny or some external mechanism. But I think there was something else as well, and it comes from, I think, the influence of people like Horst Hannon, was that he was also a believer in the rule of international law, and that he was very keen to shore up that kind of emerging system, you know, where he really strongly believed. Now, I'm going to come to this at the end because I want to talk about that in the context of the current time. But I think that's a very, you know, that move that he made, it's a classic move of an academic lawyer who's also a practitioner. I don't think it would have happened if he wasn't an academic, but I also don't think he would have struggled as much or been as ponderous about the morality of all of this if he wasn't an academic either, because he simply would have been busy doing the work for clients, and he would have been doing all of those things. That idea of the international system and recourse to the international system having some transcendent quality or some added value, do you think that that was was that an oppositional position to whatever else was going on in Northern Ireland at the time? The other kind of politics, maybe more focused on direct action, maybe more focused on paramilitarism or whatever. Like, was that a kind of an oppositional force, or was it? I'm sure it was seen as that, but was it intended as that?
Well, it's very clear. I mean, it was clear at the time, and it became even clearer doing the research for the book. Boyle was profoundly against the use of violence. He hated what the IRA was doing, and he hated what the British Army and the Loyalist paramilitaries were doing. And so I think he felt that the best chance there was a dynamic here where if you could use the law to improve conditions, and people could see that conditions were improving, then they might be less tempted to use violence to try and address grievances. And you know, back in the 70s, going to the European Commission or the Human Rights was not something that was done very often. I was astonished to discover the number of cases that were being brought to Strasbourg. I have the exact number in the book, I have to check. When he and Hannon brought that first case in 72, just a handful of cases, and almost none got accepted. So he was way ahead of his time in sort of envisioning this as a tool, back when almost nobody was using it as a tool. By the time he sort of stepped back from that 20 years later, it was a much more widely acknowledged thing. But at the time, almost nobody was doing it. And so seeing the potential of that, and then there's case after case after case, both involving, I mean, there was the Donnelly case, and there are a whole slew of others that we can talk about because they're all extremely interesting, not all directly related to the Troubles, where he went to the court. He had a pretty good track record of winning, and which led to rulings that did in fact force changes in behavior. And perhaps the most explicit example was that he was the lead lawyer in the Jeffrey Dudgeon case, which led to the decriminalization of homosexuality in Northern Ireland. And those same arguments were then used by Mary Robinson when she brought the David Norris case, which led to its legalization in the Irish Republic and then in Cyprus and elsewhere. And so I think he became convinced that this is a way you can elicit change. You don't have to kill anybody or set off a bomb. And you could show people that if you did it this way, you didn't need to do that in order to make progress.
And of course, he had a sense that the British government actually wanted to lose the Dudgeon case, because if they had a judgment from the Court of Human Rights, it would have been easier to extend the law to Northern Ireland that already applied in GB. Right. Because they could say, well, we're doing it because the Court of Human Rights told us we had to do it. So there's, I know he didn't see that case through to the end because there were other lawyers involved, but there was that kind of pragmatism as well, that he understood how you could use these wins to leverage change and how they could be kind of almost appreciated sometimes by a state, the establishment of which might want to have done something progressive. Can we move on to Galway? Just because I'm conscious of the time.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say one more interesting thing on this related theme, although it happened when Kevin was at Galway. He was really very creative in thinking about using the Strasbourg machinery, and that comes out in this episode, which I pieced together of his role trying to act as a behind-the-scenes mediator in the 1981 IRA hunger strikes, it's a sort of interesting tale. Joan Boyle mentioned that when he was at Galway, they used to have a summer cottage in Connemara, and she recalled the summer of 81, getting a phone call from Garrett Fitzgerald's wife saying, "Tell Kevin there's a plane on standby to take him and Francis Keenan, with whom he was working on this case, to Strasbourg." And I couldn't find anything else in the archive about it, but eventually, putting on my investigative reporter hat, I pieced together that he and Keenan had represented one of the the people who went on the first IRA hunger strike, end of 1980, and that case was tossed out by the Strasbourg. But two of the complaints were adjourned, sort of deferred, and after Bobby Sands' death and the IRA was getting this tremendous boost in support, the commission finally accepted those other points, and Boyle tried to use the machine, and Francis Keenan tried to use the machinery of the friendly settlement option, which is where the European Commission essentially acts as an honest broker to get people together, to see whether or not they, representing the hunger strikers and the British government, could find a middle ground. In the end, it didn't work because Margaret Thatcher pulled the plug on the process. But it was a very interesting example of how creatively he thought he could make use of the Strasbourg machinery to effect a settlement of something that was leading to rioting in the streets and deaths and all the rest.
Yeah, I mean, something similar happened in the Nicky Kelly case as well, over the 6-month rule, but it was a slightly different context, but it did work, in fact, to bring about the end of a hunger strike. You mentioned Margaret Thatcher, and again, I was just at that point of kind of, moving to Galway. The Boyle family came in 1978, and with Denny Driscoll, he established the Irish Centre for Human Rights, and coincidentally, the then president of UCG, as it was called, was the chairman of the New Ireland Forum. And Boyle and Haddon here again not only write the book that they wrote, Ireland, a Positive Proposal, but they also do this paper, and Thatcher seizes on their paper to, in a sense, move on from her famous out press conference, which so offended the then Taoiseach Garrett Fitzgerald. You wrote about this last week, I think, in the journal.ie. Would you tell us a bit more about that story? Because I think that's a real mark of the kind of quiet influence that both Boyle and Haddon had, and that really has gone unnoticed, but I think that you've drawn out quite well in the book.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and it, like the hunger strike, is something that was not immediately apparent in the archive, and it took a certain amount of detecting to put all the pieces together. But Boyle and Haddon did a submission to the New Ireland Forum and then wrote a critique, and their critique was basically that all of the proposals of the forum involved some kind of fundamental change in Northern Ireland's constitutional status. United Ireland or Joint Authority or so on. And they instead urged that the best way forward was for the two governments to agree that without changing the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, unless this majority was willing to do so, a settlement could legitimize the aspiration of the nationalist minority to work for United Ireland and to express their Irish identity, and that should be, sort of formalized in some way. And so they wrote this paper, and what I heard an anecdote about first from Joan Boyle and then from Tom Haddon, that Thatcher had taken this paper and plopped it down when Fitzgerald came to a summit in London in November of '84 and said, "I can do business with this." And I couldn't find any corroboration. And then I found a document from the British Northern Ireland Secretary, James Pryor, dated some weeks earlier, flagged to the Thatcher's private secretary saying, the Prime Minister should take a look at this Boyle-Haddon paper and underlining in it all the key points. And then that private assurance, and then I found one written reference by Boyle from 9 months later that sort of proved that something had happened at the time. And I think that took some of the sting out of the out, and encouraged Thatcher's dismissal, and encouraged Fitzgerald. And a lot of those ideas are in the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which was, of course, partly the intellectual foundation for the Good Friday deal.
Yeah, and I think Walter Kirwan as well has documented their influence very strongly, not just in the New Ireland Forum, but in the Forum for Peace and Reconciliation, later chaired by Catherine McGuinness. Then in 1986, Kevin leaves Galway and he moves to London to set up Article 19. Well, it was established, but he was the founding director of Article 19, which really deepened his interest in freedom of expression. And I think freedom of expression did become his big thing. You know, it's an area in which he had unfinished business, undoubtedly, where he collaborated very effectively with my own former colleague Marie McGonigal and later her son Thorlach McGonigal, now in the Netherlands. And then 3 years later, he went from Article 19, having established a really vibrant NGO, to Essex University to become involved and to become the director of the really famous Centre for Human Rights there, working with people like Nigel Rodley, Françoise Hamps, and others. And again, we see he's not just the teacher, he's not just the academic, but he's back litigating again and working very strongly with people like Françoise and others on, really strategic litigation in Strasbourg, for the Kurds and indeed for other groups, earning them an award in 1998, the Liberty Lawyer of the Year Award. That period, I think, that period that he spent in Essex, which really became his academic home, I think the legacy, and this is, I think, a really important part of Kevin's legacy, and something that friends of his from his early times have commented on to me, that his legacy really as a teacher of others, as an enabler of optimism in others, as somebody who spotted talent and who, encouraged talent and encouraged people to go in certain directions. I think that's an extraordinary legacy for somebody like him. It's not, we don't measure legacies purely in outputs or purely in cases that you won or whatever. It's also the people that you influence. And it strikes me that Kevin had an extraordinary gift for, influencing people for the good and making sure that the ideals that, people that would go on and improve the things that he thought about. Have you anything to say about that, or that kind of general sense of his work in that period?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. One is that he really was one of the pioneers of the idea that human rights needs to be part of education. It's now pretty widely accepted. But setting up the Human Rights Center with Denny Driscoll at Galway, and then building the Human Rights Center at Essex was a part of that. And it is quite extraordinary. He did empower his students. There's episode after episode that I write about in the book where he draws students in to helping him with projects, and then they go on to have distinguished careers. I mean, if you scratch the surface of any of the big international human rights organizations, the number of people who studied with Kevin, who are now important at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and so on and so is amazing. People one of his students went on to become Minister of Justice of Brazil, another became the Ombudsman of Costa Rica, and so on. And in some sense, you know, training this next generation to carry on fighting for human rights is a really enduring legacy, perhaps more than any specific episode or case. But I do want to just briefly mention, you talked about Article 19, which he put on the map and which today remains a very important voice for freedom of expression. But at the end, the last 6 months of his tenure at Article 19 coincided with the death sentence that Ayatollah Khomeini had issued on the writer Salman Rushdie. And I'm not sure how many people watching will remember this, but there was a famous letter that was signed by several winners of the Nobel Prize for Literature and hundreds and hundreds of other writers around the world defending Rushdie. Well, it turned out that the drafting letter, it was Boyle's idea. He wrote the draft. He was instrumental in getting the signatures along with some others. And in those very scary early months when Rushdie's Japanese translator was killed and other people associated with him in Europe were attacked, he was the public face of the campaign to defend Rushdie. And this is, you mentioned about his courage. You know, his family was not aware that how scary or how dangerous this was. It was just something he did. And equally in the 90s, while he was teaching at Essex, he also brought dozens of cases with Francois Hampson and another former student, actually, Aisling Reedy, who's now a senior lawyer at Human Rights Watch, on behalf of the beleaguered Kurds in southeastern Turkey, which led to important rulings from the European Court of Human Rights on the treatment of people detained or rape as a war crime and so on. And that also took a lot of guts to go to corners of Turkey with Turkish government army goons following them and making threats and so on. So that sort of fits this pattern, just quietly going about doing this stuff that marked much of his work.
Okay, before we go, Ruth is going to ask any of the attendees if they have questions, but before we go for the questions, I said I wanted to return to this issue of optimism, that this kind of idea that you believe in the international rule of law, that you see it as a long road, but that you're going to stay on that road no matter what. And you see that as something that's grounded in rationality, it's grounded in historical insight. It's not just some kind of faith or whatever, it's something more than that. If you look at the world now, 10 years after Kevin has died, even subtracting the awfulness of COVID-19 with which we all, contend. And if you think about things like Brexit, if you think about things like, fundamentally divided America, and that clearly is some kind of a euphemism, the rise of alt-right populism in Europe and elsewhere and all over the place, and even where you live yourself in Hong Kong, egregious human rights violations. Do you think that that kind of dogged optimism, in the sense that there is some attainable rule of international law, is nowadays, would that now be seen as just magical thinking, or would Kevin Boyle still be optimistic if he was looking at the world now?
I think it's hard to sort of say exactly what he would do, but I mean he took on in his life a number of cases or causes where the positive outcome that happened was by no means preordained, from pushing for equal rights in Northern Ireland to overturning the ban on homosexuality to any of the number of other cases that he brought to Strasbourg, to his work with Mary Robinson when she was UN High Commissioner for Human Rights during the time of 9/11, where he got deeply involved with fights which they lost with the Bush administration over how to conduct the war on terror. But I think he had a sense that this is not that you can never take any of this, you can't take any of these rights and protections for granted. And it came out of his own experience because there were so many ups and then so many downs. But I guess, you know, he was fundamentally an optimistic person, and he just felt, I found a talk he gave after they lost a case at Strasbourg that they'd brought after NATO bombed Serbian TV headquarters, and they brought a case on behalf of the journalists who were killed, and it was thrown out. And he said, yes, this is, you know, this is a defeat, but you're still, you know, you're still in the field of battle, and you still keep going. I think he'd be deeply, deeply depressed and disheartened by what's happening now, especially to see the rollback of human rights protections in places where we had more or less come to assume that with some glitches, they were relatively secure, like parts of Europe, the UK post-Brexit, the States, even Hong Kong. But I don't think that the answer would be to throw up your hands and say it's a lost cause. I think my guess is he would roll up his sleeves. He would try and, you know, build coalitions, try and find issues to do battle on that stood a chance of winning, try and apply the existing covenants in international human rights law to bring pressure on governments, knowing that you're never, you know, it's not a fight that's ever going to end. And where you tune out of it, it may be at a low point rather than a high point, but you don't really have a choice but to keep pushing. And my guess is that's probably the message he would have for today.
And I suspect he would have a skepticism about the way in which freedom of expression is nowadays weaponized by people who really aren't animated by a human rights agenda. Now, Ruth, you may have questions, I think, possibly from some of the attendees for Mike. Have you any questions?
Yes, and thank you so much, Mike and Donncha, for such a fascinating talk. We have our first question here, which comes with a bit of context to the question, so I'll read it out. Mike mentioned Boyle's courage in investigating conditions in South Africa. In December 1985, the Irish government decided in principle to introduce a unilateral ban on importing South African fruit. Rather than act precipitately, it committed to examine the means of verifying whether South Africa used prison labour in contravention of the ILO forced labour conventions. Kevin Boyle's January 1986 Amnesty International report on the operation of the pass laws in South Africa appears to have been used by the Office of the Attorney General John Rogers, to uphold its implementation of the ban on the importation of South African fruit. Is Mike aware of contacts between Boyle and the Attorney General's office in 1985, 1986?
I'm not, and I wished I had been in touch with whoever raised the question while I was writing the book, but it fits the pattern that Boyle did a mission for Amnesty International to the Gambia to observe trials of dissidents in 1981, and he produced what his colleague Nigel Rodley described to me as the finest trial report he'd ever read. And so when Amnesty decided they wanted to really focus on the pass laws, which were the laws that controlled the movement of blacks in South Africa, they asked Boyle to go and do a report. He made 2 trips, and he produced this remarkable 100-page document, which Amnesty then used as the basis for a worldwide campaign to pressure the South African government to abandon the pass laws. And it's heartening to know that, and it wouldn't surprise me at all, I didn't find any documentation in the archive about this, but it's heartening to know that that report was used elsewhere as a valuable tool, and it added to it certainly buttresses the conclusion I reached that while it wasn't Boyle alone who was responsible by any means for the end of the pass laws, but that the ratcheting up of the pressure in which the report played an important role was significant, and the pass laws were in fact withdrawn not long after. That's a fascinating episode. It just goes to show no matter how hard you work, there's always other stuff you could find that you would like to include.
Absolutely. No, I think it's clear that Kevin Boyle's life was far-ranging and had a massive impact in many areas. You've done an amazing job even covering what is in the book. I have another question here. Donncha, as you mentioned in your introduction, Kevin Boyle's obituary says it is a shame that we didn't have another 20 years of Kevin Boyle. Mike, what areas do you think Kevin might have focused on if we had had another 20 years with him?
Well, you know, one of the things that's interesting is not long before he died, he gave a talk in which he warned about the accumulation of so much power by technology companies and the threats to privacy that would result from all this. And this is the very early days of you know, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and all the rest of it. So it wouldn't surprise me that the whole issue of balancing the free flow of information with the corporate control of these very powerful tools is one area I think that he would focus on. I think also, getting back to Northern Ireland, he spoke at a conference in 2008 on the 20th anniversary of the peace agreement, in which he painted a very mixed picture of the North, in which he said, you know, yes, people aren't killing each other anymore, but it's still an extremely divided society. And you know, a lot of the potential benefits that a peace agreement ought to bring have not been achieved. So I think and now, of course, Brexit endangers that even more. So that's something else I suspect that he would be actively involved in writing and thinking and talking a lot about. I don't know if you have thoughts, Donncha.
Yeah, if I can, I think one of the things that you know, I think Kevin was a real human rights person. I think a lot of people in the political system see human rights as instrumental to achieving other things. You know, embedding a peace process and bringing about constitutional change or whatever. And I think I really strongly agree with what Mike says about some of the disappointments in relation to the Belfast Agreement, and that have been intensified and exacerbated by Brexit. I think those issues would have been really close to his heart. Not because he couldn't go along with the instrumentalizing of human rights to achieve a good political end, but because he actually really did believe in human rights and the human rights values. He was genuinely a true believer, and I think that would have become a cause of acute annoyance for him, and something that he would have worked extremely hard with others who are now working on these issues very assiduously, actually, to address.
I think one other thing that's interesting is that he wrote in the mid '80s, talking about the accident at the Soviet nuclear plant at Chernobyl and about the emerging HIV/AIDS epidemic. That he said that the importance of transparency, and he said freedom of information under these circumstances is not a luxury, but it can be literally a matter of life and death. And so, given what we've seen in terms of the way in which information about COVID has been managed, suppressed, manipulated in many different places, that's something else I think that he would be an important voice in urging you know, transparency and disclosure of information, so that people can better manage this very scary pandemic.
There's a comment which links in with what's being said from Tarlac McGonigal, where he says, when we were working together on freedom of expression issues around the time of Kevin's death, Kevin was absolutely fascinated by the growing power and sophistication operations of new forms of media and communications technologies. So as you say, Mike, that's clearly an area of growing concern.
And it fits again with this sense you have that it's not my term so much, but a number of people I spoke with talked about him as this kind of visionary figure. I mean, I don't want to, sorry, I don't want to put him up on on a pedestal here, but he sensed things earlier in a great many areas than a lot of people. and he acted on it. So identifying those kinds of trends a dozen years ago, long before they became the burning issues they are now, fits with this pattern. And we see it, you know, identifying using the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg as early as the early 70s, before anybody else was doing it. So he just had an ability to kind of sense things that before a lot of other people, and to act on them.
Well, we have another question here, which is, who does Mike think is Kevin's successor in championing human rights today?
I don't know that there is an individual successor. I think Donncha mentioned that. I think the multiple generations of people that he trained are really his successors. And they're the people who are, you know, I mean, he was a kind of unusual guy, product of very unusual circumstances in a sense. But I think there are lots and lots and lots of people who study with him over a very long time, who are out there with their sleeves rolled up, just doing the dirty work of trying to make something better. And I think that's where you see the successors.
Yeah, I think I discussed this with Mike previously about, there is a kind of there's an unusually high number of academic, activist, human rights lawyers from Northern Ireland, many of whom have an extraordinary international reach. People like Yaline, you know, Chris McCrudden, Kieran McAvoy, Colin Harvey, and that's just a selection of names. There are loads of names, and there's an unusual concentration of really influential human rights scholars who actually get involved in activism as well. Many of them, in fact, would have had strong associations with CAJ, or the Committee on the Administration of Justice. And I don't think that's in any way, you know, unconnected to the legacy of people like Kevin, and indeed many others, you know, Michael Farrell as well, Tom Haddon, loads of other people who have, you know, remained active in that area throughout their lives and have inspired others to do that. But the great thing I think about lots of the Northern Ireland activist scholars is that they've had an extraordinary positive influence beyond Northern Ireland and in other places. That's really, you know, that's really quite palpable, and definitely speaks to you know, a legacy of good influence.
We have another lovely message here. It is, my name is Catherine Shannon, and had the privilege of working with Kevin in the 1980s in efforts to make Irish Americans in the Boston area aware of the complexities of the Northern Irish conflict and the futility of the use of violence as a solution to the conflict. Kevin was eloquent in the 3 conferences that were organised between 1982 and 1985 on how the law could be used to move things forward. He was determined to build a positive transatlantic partnership to help resolve the Northern problem. His ability to work with attorneys from a Protestant background on the issue was demonstrated constantly at these meetings. His ability to inspire others to keep at the work of peace building was incredible and helped to keep me involved over many years, moving on to working for improvements in the status of women in Northern Ireland. It was an honour to know and work with him. I think that's probably one person among many who may even be here with us today who were influenced by Kevin, which is lovely to hear.
I write about one of those conferences in the book, and it was held in Boston, and it was one of these attempts, of which there were a great number, to bring people from different sides together for, you know, to see whether outside of a hothouse atmosphere of Belfast the progress could be made. And one of the other panelists there was a guy named Edgar Graham, who was a brilliant young law professor and rising star in the Unionist Party. And later that, or I think the following year, he was assassinated. He was murdered by the Provisional IRA right outside the campus. And as another example of Boyle putting aside political differences and being able to transcend the sectarian divide, he and Graham had been planning on some kind of collaborative academic research project, and he was, of course, deeply shattered by what happened. But you know, that fits this pattern of trying to find pragmatic, non-ideological solutions. That they're not always there, but that didn't stop him from trying.
And I've one final question which links in to what you were saying, Mike, about the students being the successors of Kevin's work. Perhaps it's something Donncha would know about. How do students react now when they hear, and I'm sure they do hear, especially in Galway, about Kevin Boyle's work? Are they inspired by his work, or are they surprised he's not better known in the mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think students are very, something similar happened here about maybe 2 years ago. One of my colleagues organized an event with Mary Robinson, and there was about 300 students in the audience. And I realized, just from their apparent ages, that some of them were probably not born when she was elected President of Ireland in 1990. And yet there was this extraordinary power, this extraordinary kind of impact on the students. And in fact, she actually spoke on the night about Kevin Boyle as well. And I do think that students, who don't know somebody or didn't grow up in that time do have a real interest in what they do. I don't think we do enough, by the way, in the academy to teach students on biographical details of people. I think we're far too driven by doctrine and substance and all of those things that we are obliged to do. But I do think there's a strong case for teaching students more about people, and people who were, as Kevin was, a thought leader. And I think when your legacy is like his, and these kind of events in Mike's book, I think are critically important to keep that, alive, because it's a very strange thing. That kind of influence, can have an influence in 100 years' time, for all we know. And I think that, people who didn't know Kevin will know him through this book, and will know him through other exercises and other events. And I think just because of what he did and the quality of what he did, that will influence them no matter what. And I think that's a really good thing. From the generation that did know him here, I mean, the law school in Galway when he was here was tiny. It was really small. And the people that went through at that time, many of them are now in very prominent positions, in very kind of influential positions. And when you meet people who were taught by Kevin, and indeed other colleagues at the time, Liam O'Malley, Denny Driscoll, and others who are here, when they speak about the influence that he had on them, the kind of encouragement to go off to a summer school, the encouragement to do a postgrad, the suggestion that you attend a conference or whatever, those small things actually had a huge influence on people, and an influence really for the good, and got them to elevate their sights, to be confident about their ambitions, and to go on and achieve things. And again, when we launched the Boyle Archive here in Galway, the then Attorney General, now a judge of the Court of Appeal, Maura Whelan, launched it, and she's spoken just in glowing terms about the influence that Kevin's affirmation had on her and other women from her time in the university. And I just think that's a wonderful legacy for somebody whose work transcended teaching, it transcended activism, it transcended advocacy. It was all of those things. And all of them influenced people positively for the good.
And I think, just to sort of follow on that, and sort of a final thought, even though the events that I write about in Are You With Me all happened, some of it a very long time ago, the issues remain central today, as we have been discussing, that, detention without trial, state-sanctioned killing, the rights of women, of gays, of minorities, protection, legal protections, freedom of expression, all of those things are still really important. And so there are lessons that are relevant today in what Kevin Boyle did. He was, as I mentioned, he was a very unassuming guy. He was not a self-promoter. He didn't go around boasting about what he did, which is why I was amazed in doing the research to discover how central his role was in so many episodes. And I think one of the reasons why this book is valuable is it gives him his due, which he wouldn't have cared about getting, but it deserved anyway. And when I spoke with Mary Robinson for this book, she said to me, when I told her I was doing, she said, "I'm very glad you're writing this book," she said, "because Kevin Boyle deserves to be remembered." And I think that's really true.
Absolutely. And I think there's no better note to end on that. The biography you've written, Mike, Are You With Me? Kevin Boyle and the Rise of the Human Rights Movement is a real testament to Kevin's work, and we hope will keep his memory alive for many years to come. As we said before, the book is available to buy through the Dublin Book Festival shop, the Gutter Bookshop, and through the Lilliput Press website. We also hope that if you enjoyed the talk and if you have read the book, that you let your friends know, let your colleagues know. As you can imagine, this year has been quite disruptive for all of us, and now more than ever, sharing what you like with friends, perhaps online, is an excellent way to spread the word. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much, Mike and Donncha, for a really fascinating talk.
Thanks a lot.